Okay, and I guess we'll start it officially here then. So, good morning. My name
Good
is Brian
morning.
Ullman. I write for Gem State Substack, and this is the first ever Gem State Substack live stream. And I am joined on this first episode by Wayne Hoffman, the president of the Idaho Freedom Foundation. It's a pleasure to have you here, Wayne. I appreciate you making the time, and I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Brian. Wow, what an honor to be your inaugural test subject.
Test subject indeed. I'm learning a lot about how this works, but if it goes well, then I expect to do more events like this in the future. So, for the audience, I suppose, tell us about yourself, how you got involved with the cause of freedom, and how the Freedom Foundation does its work.
Oh, that's a long question. So I'm the president of Idaho Freedom Foundation. We started the Freedom Foundation at the end of 2008. I had at that point in time been working for a member of Congress who lost re-election, and I had spent a lot of years in and around government. So, around government as a journalist back before there was such a thing as fake news. But I covered, well, there was fake news back then too, but it wasn't as pervasive as it is now. And after I got out of the journalism business, I had worked at the Idaho Statesman, the Idaho Press Tribune, and some smaller news outlets along my career. I went to work in largely Republican politics, and was working for a state agency, a couple of state agencies. Had worked for some office people who ran for and won office, and so I'd seen enough of government to know that there's something that wasn't quite right about the way things were playing out. Republicans get elected and promise they're going to be conservative, and yet government keeps growing and growing and growing. And so I was talking to a dear friend of mine who said, "Well, maybe you should start a state free market think tank." And I said, "Well, what's that?" And it turns out that there was a state free market think tank in almost every state except for Idaho at that point in time. And so you have the Heritage Foundation, Cato Institute, some of those groups that work on a national level. And then you have these other smaller think tanks that work on conservative or libertarian ish public policies all over the country. And I said, well, that sounds like fun, because then I don't have to worry about who the office holder or what letter is next to their name. I just have to worry about whether they're doing a pro conservative thing or not. And so we started that. It started out as the Gem State Institute, was renamed into Idaho Freedom Foundation just before launch at the December 2008. And we started out doing like a lot of think tanks do, which is writing white papers. And the joke is just one more white paper and we'll win the war. And it just doesn't work that way. I had a donor who called me and said, um, is there a way to know if my legislator is actually conservative or not? Because there are a couple of votes she's cast that just seemed awfully left of center. And I said, no, we don't really have a mechanism for that, but how about we create one? And we did, and it's called the Idaho Freedom Index, which is the thing that everyone now uses to see if a legislator is voting for limited government or big government. And it probably more than anything else has propelled us into the spotlight as being Idaho's most influential public policy organization. And that's the first time in the state's history that an organization from our sphere of influence has had really any kind of political clout, let alone the most political clout.
I remember I moved from Washington State 4 years ago, and we had the Evergreen Freedom Foundation that was doing similar work. But I guess it's a different fight when you're in a red state instead of a blue state. They're trying to fight against the Democrats. We're trying to fight to hold Republicans accountable for what they claim to believe in.
That's absolutely correct. And what you find is that, yes, the Evergreen Freedom Fund, now just called the Freedom Foundation in Washington State, and the Washington Policy Center, also in Washington State, they do think tank work, and they try to influence policies as best they can, working with Republicans and Democrats. But and we still work with Democrats here, but it's really the Republicans that either are a help or a hindrance to the promotion of liberty. And we find in many respects they can be quite a hindrance some days.
Mm-hmm. I'll actually jump ahead to a question I had just because it seems to go with that. Senator Jeff Agenbrod, he
Mm-hmm.
he had an editorial attacking the Freedom Foundation, saying you're engaged in bullying and manipulation. And it seems like, I've seen your ratings, your scores being used by challengers to incumbent politicians a lot. And I'm just wondering, do you think these attacks against you by Republican senators and by the TV media are they designed to take away that ability for voters to be able to have a scale to measure their incumbent delegates on?
Yes, and worse than that. So actually, let's go back a little bit. If you go to the state legislature's website and you said to yourself, I would like to know Jeff Agenbrod's record. I just want to look at Jeff Agenbrod's record. You actually can't do that. If you go to their website, there's no way for you to look at the record except for to click on every single bill that's been introduced, seeing if it was voted on, and then tallying his yes and no votes. It would probably take you months to do that if you had nothing else going on. You just have to go through every bill and tally the score. Maybe it wouldn't take you months if you just had anything going on. But if you're living a regular life, taking care of your kids or working a job or running a business or whatever, you don't have time to go do that. To make matters worse, up until now, cameras were installed in the House and Senate chambers in the year 2000. But up until 2013, the video record of the debates on the floor of the House and Senate were destroyed every 5 days. So you'd have the video created on a Monday, it was deleted on a Friday. And that was just normal. So what we did was we actually took the videos off the public television stream and we posted them on our website. And then I got this call from House and Senate leadership, and they said, Wayne, you can't do that. And I said, why can't I? And because we were saving it on our website for posterity. And they said, well, we have a rule against saving the videos more than 5 days. And I said, well, that's your rule, not mine. And so the legislature was forced in a position to have to save the videos in perpetuity. So I wasn't the only guy that had a copy of the record. So now if you go to the legislature's website, you'll see all the videos on the legislature's website going back to 2013. I say all this because there's more transparency and accountability regarding legislators than there's ever been, and they don't like that. So when you look at Jeff Agenbrod's voting record, you can argue that the Freedom Index is all wrong. That we don't score the 300 bills we look at correctly. We've gotten them all wrong or mostly wrong. Okay. All right, well, that's fine. Then how do you explain that Jeff Agenbrod votes with the most liberal Democrat 90.7% of the time? I'm not making that up. That's not something I just created. That's a fact. And I can tell you that it's not because Idaho Democrats are especially conservative. They're not. They're very left of center. And so it begs the question, what's really going on here? So, yeah, the criticism that we get is because we have made the process extremely accessible and extremely accountable. Now, I get accused of, or my team gets accused of bullying legislators. I got to tell you, we don't call legislators well, not to, we do call legislators. We don't take them to dinner. We don't call them and bully them or say if you do X, we'll do Y. There will be repercussions for your votes. We don't do any of that stuff. All we do is present the facts. We present the votes, and we do that. We present the analysis of the legislation. We do that before any House or Senate floor vote. So it's completely transparent. And the other thing is, you can see how we're scoring a bill. You can see why we're scoring a bill a certain way. And so it's not just, oh, we support this bill or, oh, we oppose this bill. It's here's why this bill is contrary to limited government. And that makes the process even more transparent. And that has really frustrated and angered guys like Jeff Agenbrod and Scott Bedke and Chuck Winder and various other people. They don't like that accountability. They loved being able to go back home to their constituents and say, I vote pro-life. I vote pro-gun. I'm a conservative. Well, okay, that's good. I'm glad you do those things. What else do? You grew Medicaid. Medicaid is now double the size as it was 6 years ago, which is a real problem. The government has more oversight over you and me than it did 5, 10, 15 years ago. What jobs we can have, what the criteria, restrictions are for getting in those jobs, for starting a business. For any interaction in the marketplace, there's government. And that didn't happen under Democrat control. That happened under Republican control.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I feel like there's people always have a feeling about what the legislators are doing. They'll see one high profile bill and they vote yes or no, and so they've got a sense of what's happening. But I think your indexes give people a lot more information, a lot more transparent information, so that they can either confirm or maybe find out that they were wrong about their feelings about what their legislators have been doing.
Mm-hmm. Yep, correct.
So I have some specific questions about how you score certain bills. I was wondering, when you're scoring spending bills, do you distinguish between government spending for things that the government's supposed to do, like build roads or whatever, and other things that they do, like give tax cuts and subsidies to businesses to come build here? Do you see those as two separate levels of overreach or growth?
They're both problematic. So let me split this out a little bit. We actually have three different measurements for
Mm-hmm.
growth in government. One is the Freedom Index. That's the most commonly known one. Then we have a thing called the Spending Index. The Spending Index looks specifically at budget bills separately from policy bills. And what we do is we look at things like, is it the proper role of government? In the category of proper role of government is, should the state own a TV station or a broadcasting outlet? Should the state be in the arts business? Should the state give money to an agency that's intended to appease a particular group of the population based on skin color? I'm talking about like the Hispanic Commission. Is the spending level appropriate? Has anybody bothered to take a look at the base spending and try to figure out ways to reduce, the starting point in government growth? Do we start at an agency that has $1 million? Maybe they don't need $1 million to start with. They need $800,000. Do we do any of those things? That's the spending index. And then the policy index looks at things like, is it expanding the role of government? Does it create a new regulation, new tax, new fee, new bureaucracy? Does it take away from the private sector? Does it make government less transparent? Does it create a new crime that didn't exist previously? Those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. I've heard several legislators say that with regard to appropriations bills, spending bills, that all they're doing is just funding what the legislature has already said they need to do, and so I think they would argue that getting dinged for voting on those isn't fair. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, just because it's something that they're supposed to already be doing doesn't mean they're doing it well. So there's plenty of waste, fraud, and abuse in different agencies. So if you say there's a state law that says we have to fund Medicaid, that's true. There is a state law that says we have to fund Medicaid, but 37% of the payments on Medicaid have been shown to be fraudulent. So should a legislator vote for that bill appropriating a bunch of money, knowing that better than a third of the spending is going fraudulently? Okay, there's a law. There's actually in the Constitution it says that we're supposed to have a public school system. Well, you still have to account for the fact the money is being wasted in administrative bloat. That some of the money is going into social justice and critical race theory. Why should a legislator vote for that? Okay, it's baked into the law, it's baked into the Constitution, but that doesn't mean that the spending bill is appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if that were the case, then if it's we're going to quadruple the spending on an agency and we're going to raise taxes to make that happen, then you'd be duty bound to vote for that, and that's just simply erroneous.
You brought up education, so I'll jump to this question. I just had a piece published this morning in Action Idaho about the progressive interests behind groups like Reclaim Idaho. And I know there's other groups like that, the Idaho 97, Take Back Idaho, etc. What do you think of all these groups that are coming from the left, but they're trying to present themselves as common sense conservative? And in the case of Reclaim, they want to, they're trying to get a petition to raise more spending, raise taxes for education.
Well, it's obvious who they are and what they are. Reclaim Idaho is a leftist organization funded by out-of-state big labor dollars. They're probably now getting out-of-state leftist education support. I wouldn't be terribly shocked to see Soros or Bill Gates behind their funding either at some level. And that's why they want that stuff. They're not common sense conservatives. They're leftists. That's exactly what they are. And what the left is tending to do in Idaho over many years is confuse the language. So if you're a conservative who votes for limited government, things that are in the Republican Party platform, you're an extremist. You're not even far right anymore. That's the language they used to use. Now they call you an extremist. If you're a legislator who votes for who's strongly against big government, except for when you're not, which is all the time, then you're a common sense conservative, which means that when presented with an idea to grow government, you're kind of okay with it, as long as the justification is good enough from the special interest groups or the agencies. So they're all being very disingenuous. They're throwing those names around, those labels, but we all know exactly what they are. Conservatives are people who vote for limited government, period, end of sentence. They don't equivocate on it. It's one of the reasons why when we do the Freedom Index, we don't judge programs whether they're good or bad, whether they're needed or not needed, because everybody's going to justify the creation of a program, right? Every bill that was ever introduced in the legislature has somebody who thinks it's a great idea. No bill has ever been introduced that people didn't want for some reason or another. They all justify it as being the right choice. So I don't judge whether a program is good or bad. I'm just judging the fact that it's being created, or whether a regulation is good or bad. I'm just saying, here it is, it exists. So if you have the question is whether you have a propensity to do that all the time. Even the most conservative legislator is going to vote for some expansion of government every now and then. They just will. They might support a fee increase or something, or they might say, well, this is a needed regulation for whatever reason. Okay. I mean, the question is whether you do that all the time. And the answer is that most legislators do it all the time. And it doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you do it all the time. And so these folks that are coming out and they're saying, oh, we're supporting the real conservatives, they're not. They're supporting the old cronyist, the old Republicans, the old establishment people who loved it when agencies would walk in the door, or a special interest group would walk in the door, and whatever it is they wanted, they got.
So it doesn't. I hear people call your organization libertarian, and I've heard you push back against that a little bit. So it's not necessarily your scores reflect how good the government programs are. It's just, like you said, that they exist. And so it gives you a measure of, if somebody's 20% on a score, then that means they're always voting to grow government and raise taxes and, expand their influence. Whereas if somebody's 90%, they're probably pretty good, right?
Yeah, the libertarian thing is a false narrative, and it's a false narrative concocted by the news media, because they've made these distinctions, and then we've tried to box ourselves into the distinctions. I would tell you that if you look at on a linear scale from radical leftist, Marxist, socialist, communist, or whatever, to anarchist, where you don't have any government, there are libertarians that describe themselves as anarchists on that scale. But most libertarians actually just believe in some measure of limited government. Some believe that you shouldn't pay for police and fire stations. I don't necessarily agree with that, but there are those out there who have that belief. But what the distinction is one concocted entirely by the news media, and we're supposed to go along with that. That they're the ones who are trying to make this distinction. All we are is an organization that believes in limited government, and sometimes that limited government philosophy. It always falls in the conservative spectrum, I think. But sometimes you pick up libertarians too who happen to agree with those same philosophies. But it's a narrative that doesn't accurately capture the truth, which is we're just an organization that supports very limited government. And we recognize the fact that government is growing all the time. If you want to put a label on that, I guess, but what's wrong with saying limited government? That's what it is. Limited government, free market, free society. Respecting constitutionally protected, meaning God-given rights.
Mm-hmm.
Is that libertarian? Is it conservative? I think it's exactly what I described it as. Stop trying to put some weird label on it.
I think I get frustrated with all the labels because either you lump yourself in with a giant group that everybody has a different opinion of, or you define it down so narrowly that it just represents yourself.
Right, but if I said, I like broccoli and cheese, you wouldn't say, well, he's a broccoli and cheesist. That's clearly all he's about. No, that's just one of the things that I happen to like eating. Stop trying to label it for what it is, or for what it's not. The reality is that we are a think tank, and one of the things that we research is growth of government, and we measure it. And so when we measure a bill and it says it's growing government, then we note that, we score that, if you will. And is that a libertarian thing to do? Is it a conservative thing to do? It's the thing that you do when you're researching growth in government. It's like if I'm a biologist and I'm hoping that there are more elk today than there were yesterday, and am I an elkist? No, I'm just a guy who studies this stuff and tries to research and report what it is I've discovered, and then you get to decide what to do with that. That's all.
It's interesting your scores, compared to say other organization scores, because the way you're explaining it, they're very quantifiable.
Right.
Does it grow government or not? It's not like your opinion's getting in there. Well, I think this is a good bill because I feel I support the issue.
That's precisely the point. So people will call us all the time, and we always say, look, I've got 4 or 5 analysts looking at legislation, and there's 300 bills. We look at more bills than anybody in the state, organizationally or in the legislature, because there are some bills that don't pass one body or another and doesn't pass committee or whatever. We look at all those bills, and so we're bound to get, I think the number every year is like 3 bills wrong, 3. So that's 1%. And we'll go back. If we get something wrong, somebody calls and says, hey, you've misread this bill, we'll change it. But we'll change the rating and we'll correct the score because we want to be accurate. But when somebody calls and says you've misscored a bill, you've misrated it, the question I always ask is, well, is the analysis wrong? Because the analysis is wrong, then we've got something. But if the analysis is correct and you're just angry because we've scored a bill negatively because you like the bill and it does the thing that you want it to do, that's another issue entirely. I'll give you an example. There was a bill last year that it said that if you have a fence line that has fallen in disrepair, then you're subject to criminal sanctions. I think it was a misdemeanor of some kind. And the bill supporters called us and said, well, why do you have that bill rated this way? That's wrong, and here's why. If a fence falls in disrepair, then the cows are going to get loose and they're going to get on my property and they're going to damage the property, and that's what we're trying to stop. And I said, well, it sounds like that's the law that you should write. Then you should write a law that says if somehow you damage my property, then you should be penalized for that, and that's a legitimate application of government power. But just because a guy's fence is falling in disrepair and now he's subject to a misdemeanor, that's a new crime, and I can't ignore that. That you like the bill, I get it. You're trying to solve a problem, but solve it in a conservative way without growing government and creating a new crime that goes on a record because a guy's fence fell down. Another example is a friend of mine called me and said, Wayne, We have this great program. We're increasing the fees for it, and you should support the bill because it's a great program. What's the program? It's the snowmobile program. And basically, it increases the fees for the registration sticker if you're registering a snowmobile in Idaho. It's like a 20% increase or something. And I said, well, we always rate every bill. Doesn't matter what the legislation is. If it's a fee increase, it's a negative rating. That's all it is. If you call me and say it's a wonderful program, everybody has a wonderful program. Everybody has an excuse for some program that they think is doing a great job that the fee should be increased. But whenever you do that, you're taking money out of the economy, you're taking money out of people's pockets. And maybe you'll want to do that from time to time. I don't know. But when you're doing it all the time, that's the problem. But that's the reason why we have the ratings. So you're conscious of the fact that you're growing government or you're taking money out of people's pockets. And we're just religious about that because it's not fair for us to sit there and go, yeah, well, that program is an exception. I like that program. Everybody's got one, right? Everybody's got a program they love. I don't, but everyone else does.
Well, I imagine if a legislator is aware of that, which I'm sure they all are now, then, I mean, maybe this sort of thing can keep them cognizant of every time they vote for a spending increase or an increase in regulations that it's going to, decrease their score. And maybe they if they don't want it to go below a certain threshold, then they better prioritize what they're actually voting for. If something's really, really, really good, then okay, then I can afford that ding on my score. But if it's
That's exactly right. We don't sit there and go, oh, looks like Senator Smith fell below 100% today. We need to go out there and break his knees. That's how it's portrayed in the media, but it's simply not. I mean, I have a lot of friends who are in the 70 and 80% range. Now, you as a constituent may judge that to be too low, and that's up to each individual legislator. But the point is that there are people who vote consistently for bigger government all the time, and they go back home and tell everybody how conservative they are. And that's the point. So we don't cast judgment on it. There are occasional bills that we'll go and we'll testify in support or against. But most of the time, we just put out the ratings and then say, go, you do you, boo-boo. I don't care, one way or another. Just, be mindful of where you are. That's all.
Well, that brings me to a question here. So I was looking at the scores for my own representatives as well as the ones in the neighboring districts. Here in District 14, which up until now included Eagle, Star, and part of Meridian. Going forward, it will be Eagle and Emmett, which is very strange. But up until this point, our representatives have scored at least 70% on every index and all the way up to 100%. However, our senator, he's a lot lower. He scores between 20 and 39% on your indexes. And I look at other districts, and that's basically the same story everywhere. That even if you've got some good members of the House, your senator is much lower. It's the Senate as a whole is much worse on this scale. Yet we're the same voters, we're the same constituents voting for the same people. How is the Senate so much worse at this?
Lack of knowledge. Well, let me just say this. So the Freedom Index, like I said, it's not everything that we do, but it's a lot. There's a lot of work that goes into it. It's our most known product. That came out in 2012, and so we've been measuring the legislature for a decade. As a result of those measurements, people have used those on their own to encourage their legislators to get better, and they have, and they've also had legislators who have seen the door, who've been shown the door, I should say. Sometimes they see the door, but most of the time they get shown, and that has resulted in the most conservative House of Representatives in the state's history from 1890, and that's not an exaggeration. That's a provable fact, and you can see the change in the House over the span of the 10 years. It has become increasingly conservative, and that's also reflected in the votes and the types of bills that are introduced and passed and so on. The Senate is a smaller body. There's not been as much turnover, and as a result of that, and also added to that, because it's a smaller body, a relatively high number of committees. You show up and you can fog a mirror and you can string a sentence together, and they make you the vice chairman or the chairman of a committee. So you're instantly important. So it's harder for the turnover to take place in the Senate. So the Senate is a lagging indicator of what's really happening in the state, coupled by the fact there are a lot of folks still out there who don't know how badly left of center their legislators are, particularly in the Senate. And so that has led to a lot of a big schism between House and Senate and between the voter reaction to them. I think it's changing. I think this year, we may see existence proof of that. It could be wrong. But I think there's a lot of noise on the ground that I haven't heard in previous years about the performance of the state Senate in particular.
Well, hopefully we will see some change. There's a lot of challengers out there who, for both the House and the Senate, and I see a lot of them using the three index scores against their opponents. Now, whereas incumbents have a record that you can judge, you can we can all judge it. You can evaluate it based on your criteria. Challengers can come in and say whatever they want. So, a challenger can say, well, the person I'm running against has an 80% score, but if I was there, I'd have 100%.
Right.
I'd vote on all of those things. How should voters go about evaluating challengers who don't actually have a record, just promises?
Yeah, that's more challenging. But what I tell everybody is that then you have to do a lot of your own homework. Now there are voter guides that get put out and candidate questionnaires that get out, and certainly the ones that are in the news media they're all leftist questions, so those aren't very helpful. But there are different interest groups who ask a lot of different questions. Um, the challenge is that individual voters have to be more mindful of things that are not just surface deep. So typically, a voter will go up to a candidate and say, "Oh, you're running. What party are you running? Oh, I'm a Republican. Oh, wonderful. Are you pro-life? Well, yeah, I'm pro-life. Well, how do you feel about the Second Amendment? Oh, I'm pro-gun. I believe in Second Amendment rights. Okay, great. How do I vote for you?" And that's it. And that's not enough. Is what I tell her. That's simply not enough. It's very easy in Idaho to tell people you're pro-life and you're pro-Second Amendment. It's really easy. What else? Do you believe in corporate welfare? You mentioned corporate. We didn't get background to that, but do you believe that big businesses should get incentives to move to Idaho? Do you believe it's okay that half the babies born in Idaho are on Medicaid? What would you do about the fact that taxpayers are forced to subsidize Idaho government television and national public radio? Should the state be giving out money to various pride events throughout the state? I mean, on and on. There's a lot of questions. There's tons of questions. What should we do about? Do you believe critical race theories in our K through 12 and higher education system? What would you do about it if you're elected? I mean, those are questions that are way deeper, and it takes more time and it takes a lot more studiousness. There are a lot of folks who are upset about the mask mandates, vaccine mandates, shutting down businesses in 2020. And what they don't recognize is those laws were passed a long time ago. They're just being used now. And that's what happens is every day there's always an excuse for growing government. Government is a lot larger than it used to be at the helm of Republicans. And so there's a reason for that. It's because you're electing folks who are only, an inch deep when it comes to their conservative principles. They're good on the stuff that's easy. So what happens is they actually vote pro-life, vote pro-gun, vote for bigger government, and they're getting checks from the teachers' unions and from the big pharma and developers and all these other special interest groups, and they're not interested in limited government. They're just interested in those two issues that get their constituents off their back. It's up to voters to ask really hard, deep, probing questions.
I've been noticing with a lot of the races that there is a lot of single issue organizations and PACs that are out there, various pro-life groups, Second Amendment groups, police groups, and they'll endorse a candidate, and I'll look at it and say, why on earth are you endorsing this person? They're terrible on this, this, and this. But then they'll say, well, they're good on this one issue that we care about. And sometimes it almost seems, maybe I'm going too far here, but it almost seems to me like they're providing cover for being able to endorse, the establishment candidates.
Maybe it's hard to know the motives. I mean, of the various groups, if they're just trying to give cover. I think there are some groups that have given out some very strange endorsements this year if they're really into limited government. And it's, you're right. It's at minimum, it is a cover for the incumbent. It allows for them to wave that banner around. Oh, I'm endorsed by this group, and I've got an A+ from that group. But it's also a way to deceive voters because they think they're getting something that they're not. They're getting, a chocolate-covered turd in a punch bowl, if you will, maybe.
So I listened to your interview with Representative Priscilla Giddings, who's obviously running for lieutenant governor, and she suggested that you somehow come up with a freedom index for judges. And it made me think, is there any way to use the same heuristics that you've developed for the legislature to evaluate judges or, the governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, these people who are outside the legislative process, but they still have a lot of influence over our society?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. We are looking to do that. It's a little more challenging with judges because they're scattered all over the state and there's no centralized resource to look at each of the individual rulings. So it's something we are looking at, though, because we do think there's a problem in the judiciary. I brought this up with Governor Little twice last year, never really got a response. But my question was, okay, you've appointed these judges, these attorneys to the judicial branch as a district judge or whatever, or you've appointed them to be a state Supreme Court justice, as the case may be. What did you look for to indicate these people are conservative? And I didn't get any real answer back. And the answer is we don't know. We hear about their legal practices. We hear about the fact they might have worked in a state agency as a deputy AG for a number of years, or that they have been served on the bench for a certain amount of time, and that doesn't tell me anything. That doesn't tell me anything. And I want to ask the question, are you a Scalia or a Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and what's the answer to that question? So, yeah, it's something we are looking at doing, though.
And that would be interesting to see. I think, the recent, a couple of recent court rulings have, I think, gotten a little of attention from conservative voters, and they want to know how they can exert, any influence over that. And, all we're given is the option to retain them on the ballot, which doesn't really do anything.
Right.
Yeah, it's I think for a long time Republicans have closed their eyes to the when it comes to the judiciary, the ability for them to really move our society. The Republicans at the national level would often just rubber stamp whatever Democrat nominee there was. And meanwhile, the Democrats, they knew the power of the court, and that's why they would fight tooth and nail against anyone, going all the way back to Robert Bork.
Yeah, and we don't do that here, and so it's a real concern that I think the judiciary here in Idaho is already in a lot of trouble. I think you see that with some recent Supreme Court rulings. The one on Medicaid expansion that we were involved in back in 2018, beginning of 2019, where the question was, does the legislature have the authority to delegate its authority to the federal government with regards to the administration of this program? And the court said, oh, sure, we do it all the time anyway, so it must be all right. And then later on, the court was asked to weigh in on whether the legislature can, up the number of signatures gathered for initiatives. It says it right in the Constitution they can do it. And the court ruled, oh, no, they don't have that power. That was a really weird ruling. There was a ruling not so long ago where the Supreme Court said pretty much every case that comes before the into the hospital for reimbursement by state and local taxpayers, that has to be paid for. It doesn't matter what it is. It's a medical necessity. Otherwise, the doctors wouldn't have asked for it. And then there, of course, is the the redistricting ruling from earlier in the year, where the court set aside two previous rulings, and reread the plain wording of the statute and the Constitution to keep in place the legislative maps that we have today. So I think the court is way off track, and it's worrisome that there's really there's no recourse after that. You know, if they start rereading the Constitution and statutes to whatever they want it to say, then you no longer have a constitutional republic anymore, which we're guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. So that's concerning.
Yeah, if people, whether they're on the Supreme Court or in the executive branch or in the Attorney General's office, can just reinterpret the Constitution instead of actually following the text that was written and put in there, then, yeah, I mean, what's to stop them from just making anything up?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
So I guess there's a philosophical question I've been wrestling with, because we've identified the problems with our state, we've identified the problems with the government. The question is how to change it. And I was listening to your interview with Senator Stephen Thane recently, and you were going back and forth because he's saying that you have to work within the system, you have to get buy-in from all the stakeholders, you have to move the needle gradually, because you can't really do it all in one go. And you were, especially with education, you would tell him that, what about all the children who are graduating in the failed system now? And you used the analogy of rolling a grenade into the room to blow it all up. And I definitely feel that. But sometimes it seems like we send people into the legislature, with their pack of grenades, and they end up getting marginalized and they don't get anything done. So the philosophical question I wrestle with is, what's the best way to fix this? Is it to get someone into the system and work within it? Or is it to send someone like a Trump sort of figure from outside to just disrupt the whole thing?
Well, I mean, the leftists, certainly the Fabians believe that you have to be incrementalist, and they've been doing that for decades. They started a long time ago, and it started with well, I mean, it's hard to say exactly where it started. Probably started with the public education system, getting kids out of their homes and into a school run by the government, controlled by professional educators and not just people from the community who kind of understood how to go and educate children. And the school board, it had some oversight over the school teachers that were hired. So perhaps the 1850s. Probably started there with what we call then into the progressive era, where there was an effort to well, we call it the progressive era, but it's way worse than this. Socialist era, where we go and work to get income tax, wealth redistribution codified into law, into our various constitutions, in the U.S. Constitution and various state constitutions. Also, and then restricting private property rights over many years, restricting gun rights, restricting freedom of speech. It's all been very incremental, right? I mean, now when Obamacare came around, and people were compelled to buy health insurance, what was the constant response to that? It was, well, you're already made to buy auto insurance, so that must be okay. And two, the Heritage Foundation liked it, so it must be conservative. And that's just nonsense. I mean, this has been the incremental thing, and they get people to buy in to that incrementalism. Well, okay, just this once. It's like meth. You do, I suppose I haven't done meth, but I understand that it's this way, that if you do it once, that's like Pringles. You want to go back and do it again. But that's the way government is. And also the Federal Reserve Banking, which put a lot more money into the system, which allowed for there to flow more money into government, which expanded socialism. So, I mean, there's a lot of different things that have happened over many years. The left loves incrementalism, is what I'm trying to say. I think the right loves strong conservative principles, and they want people to hold to those values, and they really want to see people who are emphatic about those beliefs. That's why Trump was well loved. That's why Reagan was well loved. You'll notice the interim presidents, the Republican presidents, haven't been so well loved. George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush. And the candidates for the Republican nomination, Republican nominees in presidential races who weren't, diehard conservatives. I mean, people still talk about Barry Goldwater to this day, right? But people don't talk about other Republican contenders, but John McCain and Mitt Romney will soon be forgotten as Republican nominees for president. I sometimes forget that they ran for president myself, that they were the nominees, because they are completely forgettable figures with completely forgettable track records, with a completely forgettable agenda. They basically, they're indistinguishable from leftists. So I think the socialists, the communists, the Fabians, the various the Marxists, they all angle towards incrementalism. That's their shtick. But conservatives should fight tooth and nail for limited government and all manner of government. They've allowed this to take place, and then so it's like Medicaid. Okay, Medicaid is pure wealth redistribution, pure socialism, right? But people on our side go, well, what if we put a work requirement in? So you mean if a guy mows my lawn, then he's allowed to sleep at my house? Is that how this works? I don't understand the metaphor here. It's either socialism or it's not. It's either wrong or it's not. And I'm not going to equivocate on that. And I think if you're a conservative and you believe socialism is bad and wrong and corrupt and perhaps even detrimental to the well-being of country, you should just be against it, not try to accommodate it.
Well, the problem I see is that the conservative voters, we're like a trailer attached to the left-wing truck. We're always moving. It's hard enough to get a conservative voter nowadays to support ending a government program from just 5 years ago. The Republicans in Congress couldn't even undo Obamacare, much less go back to before the Great Society, go before the New Deal, go before the public education. It seems like a very tall hill to climb. So would incrementalism work in that case to slowly start taking back?
You're proving my point for me, though. The people that we've elected who claim to be conservative aren't really conservative. Otherwise, getting rid of Obamacare would have been easy, right? And how many times did the Republican Congress vote to repeal Obamacare until suddenly they had a Republican president and suddenly they weren't able to do it anymore? So they did it for show. They did it to deceive their voters. And then when their vote had consequences, they said, "Oh no, that we can't do that." And then they roll, John McCain into the Senate, and he puts his thumb down and says, "We're not doing this. This is wrong." That tells you exactly where you are. And the same thing. I had a bet with Stephen Thain in 2011. Because at the time the state was going through a recession. They didn't really want to raise taxes, but they didn't want to cut programs. And so Thain suggested getting rid of kindergarten, because kindergarten is a useless government program. And I said, I don't see how this legislature is going to do that. Maybe they'll get rid of the Arts Commission. And we had a bet, which would happen first. The Arts Commission, which is totally useless, serves no real function. You can do without it and everybody will still live. Or kindergarten, which doesn't really educate kids, it just babysits them, but has a bigger price tag. Which would the state legislature controlled by Republicans do first? And the answer is neither, because they simply won't do it, because the Republicans in office are not conservatives. If they were conservatives, they would be willing to do it. They wouldn't flinch at it. And that's the reason why when people saw a guy like Reagan or a guy like Trump, they still celebrate it. To this day, they're still celebrating Reagan. And I would argue that Reagan didn't do near as much as, as a conservative you'd want him to do. Maybe it was a function of having to work with a crazy, out of control Congress with all those liberal Republicans and Democrats anyway. But look at Trump. Trump did a lot of deregulation that was opposed by Republicans. But I think he is admired and revered for the fact that he was willing to be a genuine conservative president. No holds barred, unafraid to tell the truth president. And I have to admire that. And I think in the Idaho legislature, the most admired legislators, the ones that go home and they've got parades being thrown for them, are people like Heather Scott and Priscilla Giddings and Dorothy Moon and Christy Zitto, and they're the Ron Nate. They're the ones who have been hailed as heroes because they're diehard conservatives. And they recognize what they're there for, and they're not there to make the special interests happy. So I that's a long way of answering. I think incrementalism has worked for the socialists. It really has. And the Marxists and the Fabians and anyway, all the that's their shtick. Incrementalism the world over has worked for those characters and has destroyed countries as a result. For the conservatives, we have to be all in on what we're trying to do. There's no equivocation. I'll just say this one last thing on that. There's no equivocation on constitutional rights. Who am I to say that a person's constitutionally protected, God-given right is something we can negotiate over? I can't do that, and I won't do that.
I think we have a Republican Party that's much further to the left than the Republican base, and yet we keep ending up with a lot of the same leaders. We're seeing some turnover, but sometimes it just seems like it's not happening fast enough. Trump, when he was in office, he got a lot done, but then he was, both parties joined together to destroy him. And I think we see that where it's like, you send somebody in there, a Ron Nate or a Tammy Nichols, Priscilla Giddings, who is going to go in there and disrupt the system, and the system, both left and right and center and whomever else, it acts like they're a virus that must be expelled.
Yeah, exactly. Because I suppose a virus is a good comparison, because there is this foreign body that has invaded this thing that has been well protected through various inoculations over many years. And the system is just designed that way. It favors the special interest groups. It favors the politicians who help those special interest groups out. It favors the bureaucracy. And when somebody shows up and says something, how many times I've talked to a legislator or committee chairman, and here's a policy idea, and the legislator looks at me and says, "Gosh, that sounds interesting. What does the agency think of that?" Well, how about who the hell cares what the agency thinks? Maybe the agency should just deal with it because that's the law that's been written.
Mm-hmm.
What they think is somewhat irrelevant. They just have to implement. And that's the distinction between, say, a guy, or no, I'll use Christy Zitto. I think Christy. I don't want to sound like I'm pitching for any candidate that's up for election, but Christy's not running again. So Christy doesn't care. Christy votes the way she does because it best benefits her constituent, not because it conveniences or inconveniences an agency, and that's very, very different.
And the deep state we see at the top level, at the federal level, it's the federal bureaucracy, the employees and managers and policymakers who stay there for decades, no matter who's president or in Congress. I guess we have our own miniature deep state in Idaho, where the bureaucrats in the executive branch, the government employees, they're there no matter who we send to the legislature, and their friends in the lobby groups and the big business organizations, they're there no matter what. And I think after a while they start to think that they're actually the ones in charge.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Well, we're nearing the end of the hour, and I've very much appreciated your time. I could talk to you for hours more just about the Marxists and the Fabians. That's but that's a bit of a different topic. Is there anything else you want to tell us about the Freedom Foundation itself, or what you're doing, what you want people to know?
Well, first of all, there's a lot of stuff that gets written about us in the press. We have a policy of not talking to the media anymore because they can't be trusted unless they've demonstrated that they can be trusted, which most of them have not. They're shilling for the left, and that's unfortunate. But one of the things that you read in the paper, if you do, is that we're funded by people from out of state, dark money or whatever. They don't know because they've never seen our donor list, and the reason they've never seen our donor list is because we don't share that with people. because we don't want them to be harassed by the left. 97% of our donors come from right here in Idaho, and they donate because they care about the work that we do, and they care about this country and the future of the country, and they see Idaho as a state that can make a difference in preventing the United States from becoming another communist or socialist hellhole, the likes of Venezuela or Cuba. There are no magic beans that keep that from happening. And just because people say they're conservative doesn't mean they are. And that's the role that we play. And that's why our donors love the work that we do. So I feel after 14 years of doing this, it's important whenever I can to thank the people who have made it possible, the ordinary Idahoans who write big and small checks to us, and know that we're going to use every penny to fight for a free country going forward. So I appreciate the opportunity to do that with you today.
Yeah, and I appreciate the conversation, and I appreciate everything you do to get that, to go through those hundreds of bills and try and quantify it in a way that it's easy for folks to understand. Because you're right, it would take months for any one of us to just go through and see exactly how our legislators voted on those things.
Yep. Well, thank you for your writings too. I've enjoyed reading your stuff.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it, and I hope to keep doing this for a while.
Yeah, and anytime you want us to come back on, me or anyone on my team, just let us know, okay?
Oh, I'd love that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, sir.